Okay, good. Let me get my hair together. It's been a while since I've had a haircut. The last haircut I got was a buzz cut, and it's kind of changed my appearance overall. So let's see. A couple of questions were asked more than once.
Okay, let me open the meeting with our normal stuff. Hey, welcome everybody to the Portland Psychedelic Society. I'm Jayson, a volunteer. This is a volunteer, and every month we have probably 15 to 20 such meetings going on. I'd encourage you to check out our meetup page to learn more about each one of those. If you'd like to donate to keep these awesome meetings going, when you find that no one is doing these, or that no one's doing these as accessibly as we are, to make a donation, you can do that at www.portlandpsychedelicsociety.org. There's a donate button. You can do it through PayPal. So this is a place not to ask where we can get DMT. This is a question and answer. This is informational. We do not do illegal activities in these meetings. We do not solicit for substances in these meetings. And please be respectful of the organization and the event so that we can keep really great stuff like this happening. Dr. Strassman is the top guy on DMT. What I very little know about Dr. Strassman, and I'll try to bullet point the intro, he was doing research in the 80s on a hormone called melatonin, and which led him to start leading to believe about the pineal gland, into his research later into the 90s, doing government-funded research, injecting people with DMT, and which was the basis for the book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, and the documentary that we've all seen with Joe Rogan, DMT, the Spirit Molecule. And he is the guy, and he is out of the University of New Mexico. I'll let you clarify anything that I might have mispunctuated on that, Dr. Strassman, but I'll turn it over to you, and you have as much time as you need to ask last time's questions.
Okay, yeah, sure. Okay, well, so thanks, Jayson. Yeah, I apologize for what happened last time, the lightning bolt. There was a lightning strike on the Wi-Fi tower nearby me, so I lost internet for about 3 hours. It's cloudy out. With the monsoons in the desert Southwest, they usually strike about now, but even though it's clouding up, it doesn't seem like there's much storm activity, but one can never say. The power goes out here erratically. Well, one question I was asked a couple of times was whether or not I've done DMT, and I finally came out of the closet last year at a conference in Sedona with Graham Hancock, and I described my first DMT experience that I had with Terence McKenna, which was in '86, I think, or '87. And I just finished giving a talk at a conference, a center in California. And it was about the pineal DMT, those kinds of things. And so Terence came up to me afterwards and said, well, you're talking about DMT. Would you like to see what it's like? So I jumped at the opportunity. Yeah, and we went to one of the rooms in the conference retreat center, and there were a number of my friends that were in the room as well. Yeah, and it was great being initiated into DMT by Terence. He gave very good instructions, and the experience of itself consisted of going out of body. I entered into the DMT world, and then soon, or quite soon, I beheld this flaming waterfall, flaming colors, maybe 40 feet tall, a flaming waterfall of colors, and out of those. Out of the waterfall emerged 3 or 4, maybe half a dozen of these little beings, about 3 feet high, 4 feet high, they looked like the grays, but their heads weren't quite so big. I had never seen a gray before. This was a complete surprise to me. And they emerged and they looked right at me and they said, "Now do you see? Now do you see?" Over and over again. Now do you see? Now do you see? Yeah, so that was basically the experience. The experience started to fade. The entities merged back into the colorful waterfall, and after that, I decided to stop my melatonin work and start the DMT project. So it was one of those transformative experiences, at least in the short run. And I think I've been impelled or propelled or attracted to that question ever since too, which is one of the reasons I've been kind of going from one area to the other. I mean, I started with TRH, thyroid stimulating hormone, then to melatonin, and then to DMT, and then to the Hebrew Bible, now to autobiographical fiction. So it isn't like I can stay put. I mean, I'm kind of I like to go where the data is pointing me. So I mean that can be, I guess, summarized by that. By the mantra, now do you see, now do you see? So that was the question. Have you tried it yourself? And, one of the, follow-up, questions was, what have you done with that information? And I changed my career and, studied DMT for, 5 years. So, there were a number of questions about the beings, the entities. What's their ontological foundation? Are they archetypes? Where do they reside? It's impossible, to really, say with any certainty what the DMT beings are. Kind of the overall, category I placed them into is previously invisible things. They're now visible, but they were not visible before. So that basically contains anything that is either completely generated in your mind-brain complex. It's your brain on drugs. Ranging all of the way, to the other end of the spectrum, which would include, beings from another planet, another star system, dark matter, parallel universes, dark energy. But I just don't think we can, or, they could be Jungian archetypes, they could be, visual representations of unconscious, conflicts or drives, from a kind of, psychoanalytic perspective. I'm not that well versed in Jung and, the archetypes, but it, could be that. I mean, it, could be, some kind of download from the collective unconscious. It also, could be, some divine, some, divine overflow, some divine communication, which is one of the, ways I conceptualized it in my Prophetic States book that came out in 2014. But instead of actually, instead of being, instead of being over concerned with, their ontology, how they appear, what the brain mechanisms are, what the psychological mechanisms are, the spiritual ones, I've turned to paying more attention to what they're trying to communicate. What's the information that they're trying to transmit? How do we understand what is being, transferred to us? How do we understand, the information content that the beings are, participating in? How do you understand it? How how do you optimize it? How do you interpret it? How do you communicate it? How do you apply it in your personal life, your social life? So that's why it's clear that the DMT beings are extremely novel, extremely powerful. Their reality is quite convincing. They're more real than anything else, or they're more real than real anyway. But beyond that, I think we need to look at what is the information which their function is to convey. So that's one of the reasons I have veered into the Hebrew Bible as well, is because it's a tradition, it's a text which is loaded with beings who communicate information of a particular type. And relative to the other religions out there, it's the richest, I think, in that kind of a model, an interactive relational model, where the function of the beings is to transmit information, and the function of the person receiving it is to understand it, to optimize the extraction of it, and to then communicate it to the larger culture. So they could be anything. They're previously invisible. They could be anything. But more important than what they are is what they're doing and why. So ontological. Okay, screening. The screening of our volunteers. The first group of volunteers were my friends. People that were rooting for me from the sidelines. You could do it, Rick. You could do it. Don't give up. We'll be in line. We'll volunteer. You can do anything that you want to us. And so I knew these people. They were all experienced psychedelic folks. I took drugs with them over this course of many years. So we knew each other and we trusted each other, and they were quite eager to altruistically, to a large extent, volunteer for the study. Once the studies expanded it, and we, were doing other, projects with DMT and with, psilocybin, we had a screening procedure. Usually it was word of mouth, how people, found out about the study. They would call me in the psychiatry department at the University of New Mexico. And, we would have a, 10, 15-minute phone call. So I was interested in their, being experienced previously with, psychedelics, because I didn't want people to panic. And I also, wanted them, to be good describers of what the experience was like, especially, to compare it, with other drugs, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline. So, that was, the reason I included only experienced individuals. One of the things I asked, people on the phone was what their worst experiences were on psychedelics and how they manage them. So, one guy, told me, well, every time I take, psilocybin, I, land on top of a roof of a nearby building, and I, don't know how I got up there, and I have to get myself down. So I screened that guy out, just on the phone. So I also was interested in if they're on any current psychiatric medications, if they're suffering from any acute psychological psychiatric conditions. So once we went through that initial screening phone call, they came in for a physical exam and some laboratory work and a cardiogram. We excluded anyone with an abnormal cardiogram or with elevated blood pressure, anemia, those kinds of things we screen for. Once they got through the physical exam, they underwent extensive psychiatric screening interview which was called the SKID at the time. It's about a 2-hour interview, to determine if they were currently mentally ill or had suffered any kinds of mental illness in the past. We included people with a history of depression a year or two or longer ago, especially if the kinds of circumstances that led to the depression in the first place have taken care of themselves, if they're not under the same kind of stressors they were that precipitated their previous depression. We didn't include anybody on current psychiatric medications. So then we gave quite a few questionnaires, and then people came in for screening doses, a small dose, just slightly larger than placebo. If people's blood pressure increased too much, we dropped them from the study. If they didn't like the psychological effect of the small dose, we dropped them from the study. Then the next day they came in to get a large dose, which was kind of the gold standard of how high they would get through participation in the whole study. And if people didn't like that experience, they would drop out. We hadn't collected any blood samples or any questionnaires, so these were more like screening doses. And then they participated in whatever study they had volunteered for. So religious or spiritual backgrounds of the volunteers, most of them, were meditators. A large number of them belonged to the pagan Wicca community in Albuquerque. I was friends with a number of those folks and went to some of their ceremonies, and would recruit either before or afterwards. So a large number of them were pagans, nature-based religions. Most everybody meditated in some form or another. Eastern meditations, Buddhism, Hinduism, mantra, chanting. Which was interesting because most everybody, including myself, expected a enlightenment kind of experience, a kensho or satori, based on the ultimate goal of Eastern religious practice. The dissolution of the ego, no time, no space, no content, no personality. But only one person in the whole study, over close to 5 people, had that kind of experience. Everyone else had contentful, interactive, relational types of states. So those surprised me, those kinds of experiences. I wasn't expecting them. I wasn't hoping for them. And the same with the volunteers. They were expecting a different kind of religious or spiritual experience. There weren't any. Well, there were two Jewish people in the study. A software designer and a physician. I think that was it. And neither were especially observant. They strongly identified as being Jewish, but they didn't keep kosher or pray or go to the synagogue or late to fill in that kind of stuff. There were no Catholics. There were a couple of Hindu types, a couple of Buddhist types. Lots of people that were spiritual, not religious. So I would imagine like most of you all. I remember this question. It's a strange question and one I had never really considered. Does the fast metabolism of DMT in the body mean we're not supposed to do it? So that's a strange way of looking at the fast metabolism of DMT. But I can understand it because anything that's broken down that quickly, if it accumulates too much, too rapidly, it could be dangerous. But the answer I usually give, when asked about the rapid metabolism of DMT, is it needs to be maintained at a very fine-tuned level, at a narrow window in the brain. Otherwise, if it's too high, things get weird, or if it's too low, I would guess things get weird. Although we don't know much about the underactive DMT state, but the primary reason I think that DMT is metabolized so quickly is because there's a moment to moment equilibration between the mind, uh, the external world, subjective experience, uh, which I think is mediated by DMT. Um, you know, uh, Well, so last year there was a group at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, that discovered that the brain makes DMT, rather than the pineal gland, and it makes DMT in concentrations comparable, to well-known neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. So it suggests the existence of a DMT neurotransmitter system, which is a mind-blowing concept. You would wonder, well, what is the role of a DMT neurotransmitter system? And if you extrapolate, or if you interpolate, or you carry forth an analogy, what is the function of serotonin? Well, it's for mood, visions. Dopamine is for reward. Norepinephrine is stimulating. It's for stimulatory activity in the mind. So what is the hallmark of the DMT experience? Well, I think it's the conviction of the reality of what you're apprehending. It's the hallmark of the DMT experience is that it feels more real than real. So it is tempting to speculate that the role of a DMT neurotransmitter system would be to mediate the sense of reality in an ongoing manner, on an ongoing basis. So if that were the case, you would definitely need to keep the levels of DMT within a moment to moment narrowly defined optimal level. If we weren't supposed to take DMT, and that's the reason it is metabolized so quickly, you would think that using DMT would make you sick. You'd throw up, you'd have a seizure, you'd have diarrhea. It would affect your heart in a bad way. You would think there would be some toxicity. But in a normal, healthy person, there's no DMT toxicity. So I don't think the idea that we shouldn't do it, and that's why it's metabolized so quickly, is a valid model. So speaking of metabolism, it's DMT is broken down by at least two major systems. One of them is the enzyme monoamine oxidase type A, which produces a metabolite which is called indolacetic acid, which is also a compound compound on plants. Very interesting thing. It's responsible for the growth tip elongation in a young plant. But it's kind of a non-specific metabolite. If you give DMT and you measure in you measure in dolacetic acid, it could come from serotonin, from DMT, from tryptamine. When you give inhibitor of monoamine oxidase A in combination with DMT, like occurs with ayahuasca, the DMT is oxidized rather than deaminated. Monoamine oxidase deaminates DMT. If that pathway is blockaded, then it's oxidized, and you get a compound which is called DMT oxide. And you can measure that in the urine and the blood as well. And the concentrations in people that drink ayahuasca are quite high, even higher than levels of DMT. There is a kynuramine pathway. For those biochemistry geeks out there, kynuramine, and it's pretty obscure. I would have to look at the paper to refresh my memory. But if somebody wants to go look up the kynuramine metabolic pathway on the DMT, it might be interesting. So let's see. Related to that question about rapid metabolism and the potential toxicity of DMT. One of the questions was about the notion of DMT as a schizotoxin. When DMT was discovered in human blood, urine, and spinal fluid, psychiatry was very keen on determining if it played a role in naturally occurring psychoses. In other words, did schizophrenics produce too much DMT, or they broke it down too slowly, or were their receptors especially sensitive to DMT? So those studies never really got off the ground. The methodology for measuring DMT in the blood wasn't able to distinguish between schizophrenics compared to normal controls. The metabolism wasn't really well worked out to be able to determine if there were differences in metabolism. Nobody really looked at increased or decreased sensitivity to giving DMT in psychotics versus normals. So it's interesting that psychiatry was focused on the schizotoxin idea. Nobody put two and two together and said, oh, maybe it's responsible for other psychedelic states of consciousness which occur without drugs, like mystical experiences or religious experiences, creativity, things like that. Instead, it was focused on focused on the pathology. Oh, and well, so along the lines of the schizophrenia approach, people were looking at developing antibodies to DMT. Could you blockade the effect of DMT through antibodies? There was also some interest in developing anti-schizophrenic medications, which were based on blockading psychedelic effects in normal volunteers. There was a fair amount of animal research, looking at compounds which could blockade the effects of LSD. And in fact, all of these new anti-psychotic medications out there, risperidone, Zyprexa, Abilify, Geodon, those were all developed, based on psychedelic research in lower animals. They discovered that a specific serotonin receptor was responsible for the behavioral effects of LSD in lower animals. And they developed compounds which blockaded that serotonin 2 receptor. So these new I suppose they're not that new anymore. But risperidone-like drugs, Zyprexa-like drugs, those blockade serotonin 2 receptors. In addition, to the dopamine ones, which the older ones, the older antipsychotics, blockaded only. So the combination of blockading dopamine and the serotonin 2 receptor with the second generation um, the anti-schizophrenic agents, was a development which emerged out of psychedelic uh, drug studies. The schizophrenia DMT connection, it just never really gained that much traction. And one of my mentors in San Diego, I did a clinical psychopharmacology fellowship at UC San Diego at La Jolla. One of my mentors, there was a sleep researcher named Chris Gillen, who actually began his career giving DMT in the 60s and the 70s. And in 1976, Chris wrote a paper, declaring the end of the DMT schizophrenia model. He stated that the idea deserved a decent burial. So I asked him about that comment, and he said, the politics were crazy. The assay methodology wasn't working out. It was uncool to study psychedelics, even if you're just speculating about their role in naturally occurring diseases. So he felt slightly embarrassed by that. But as a result, he was quite encouraging and supportive of the work. Once I transferred over to UNM. But yeah, in the States, the schizotoxin model fell into disrepute. It still has got some traction in Europe. The psychotomimetic drug label. There was a German study which the results were published in English in 2005 and 6, and it was a study comparing giving intravenous DMT in a group of people and giving them schizophrenia rating scales. These were normal volunteers. Give them DMT and give them schizophrenia questionnaires, and like a few days later give them ketamine and give them schizophrenia questionnaires. So they were looking at being able to distinguish what's called the positive symptoms of schizophrenia from the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So based on their study, they published this paper saying DMT mimics the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. So when you think about psychedelics of any sort, possessing inherent spiritual properties, one of the things I like to do is to point to that study, saying if you give psychedelic to people and you say this is going to reproduce schizophrenic symptoms, and you give them questionnaires which monitor or measure schizophrenic symptoms, voila, your volunteers look schizophrenic for an hour or two. So that's an interesting comment on anyone who says, oh, these drugs are inherently spiritual or inherently this or that. So the Europeans are still interested in the schizotoxic model, and I think it's a good model. We don't understand the sensitivity of schizophrenics to DMT. Is their gene more active that makes the enzyme responsible for DMT synthesis in the brain? There's a lot of questions about psychosis and any other non-drug state whose phenomenology overlaps with the DMT experience. So any non-drug state that resembles what happens when you give DMT, it makes sense that there could be a role for endogenous DMT in that non-drug state. Terence McKenna likes to Dennis McKenna likes to joke when people talk about, well, is it drugs or is it your brain? And Dennis likes to say it's all chemicals. It's either ones naturally produced or ones that you take in from from the outside. There were a couple of questions about a paper Andrew Gallimore and I published in 2016. So Andrew is a British psychopharmacologist, cognitive science, computer science guy, kind of a Renaissance type, and he's working in a university in Japan. And a few years ago, he contacted me and was interested in following up an idea which appears at the end of the DMT book about infusing people continuously with an IV infusion of DMT in order to prolong the state, fine tune it. Perhaps it could be used or exploited as a psychotherapeutic tool. You can put um, you could put people into the state. You can increase it. You could decrease it. You could take them down. To do some talk therapy. Give them as much time as they might need to process. Yeah, so it would also, provide a much more, leisurely, way of exploring the DMT state. One of the, problems with communicating, with the beings in the, single, blast of DMT, either smoking or intravenous injection, is there's just, not enough, time to establish good communication. There's a lot of anxiety on the part of the volunteer, getting their bearings. The language, what are they speaking? Are they speaking English? Are they speaking telepathically? Are they speaking with hand signals, with colors, with shapes, with feelings? Yeah, so it takes some time to establish the means of communication. And once you do, you start coming down. So if you could stay in that state for an hour or two or longer, you would be able to establish better communication with the beings. You could ask them questions. For example, prime factoring questions. Mathematical questions which you wouldn't be able to figure out on your own, even if you were some kind of a genius. So that's one of the theories about establishing the ontological bases of the beings. If you give them an impossible math question and they answer it correctly, then perhaps they've got an objective existence of their own. But that assumes quite a few things. For example, would they want to tell you what the answer is? They might just want to goof with you. They may not know. So yeah, they may not want to tell you. So there's all kinds of problems in a study like that. But at least you could do it, which you can't really do when you're just in the state for 5 or 10 minutes. You could tinker in that state too. What is what is the nature of those things in the in the DMT world? All those objects. If you hit them with a hammer, would they spark? Would the hammer go through? Would they make a sound? So you could really explore the phenomenology with a prolonged infusion study like that. So there is a group in England that's giving DMT now. More the phenomenology, characterizing the subjective experience and correlating that with brain imaging changes. It's a group at Imperial College. Christopher Timmerman is the main investigator. Robin Carhart Harris, runs the whole division, but Chris is the one who's working nowadays with DMT. So they're quite, keen on, developing, the infusion. But like all, clinical research is kind of, ground to a halt. But they were, working out the models, how much do you start with, what's the infusion rate after the, loading dose, what's the, time course that you could expect to see. I've heard through the grapevine, there's a German group that's been working on an infusion study as well, but I haven't, been in contact with them, and I haven't, seen any, papers, that they've written. So, that's the infusion study. I think it'd be a, very cool study. For example, you could keep the astronauts in a, DMT state for a long, long time as they're going to Mars. Like, how do you keep these, people busy or occupied, for 3 years? So, people could spend a lot of time in the DMT state, perhaps, for interplanetary, travel, as it were. Sorry about this phone.
Your audio is still really good.
Yeah, can you say that again? Okay.
I said your audio has been very good, and it's been very good throughout.
Oh, great. Good. I'm happy. Yeah, that's unusual. So I suppose, the cosmos is making up, for that lightning strike. Because, most, people complain bitterly of, my connection. So there's a question about using beta carbolines to extend, the IV, DMT state. I didn't, do that study. It, could be done, but I think there wouldn't be any point. You could just give more DMT or give it longer. It would, prolong the state and, probably increase, the intensity, but, and I suppose if you were doing strict, psychopharmacology work, you wanted to, confirm, the ayahuasca effect. I suppose you could do a study like that, or you could, pre-treat, with a, with a beta carboline, orally, and then, give DMT orally, like a, pharmahuasca kind of mix. Well, I've heard, people, will, take harmaline or harmine, take it orally, and, then like a half hour later, take mushrooms. And that's really intense, really long. I wouldn't, I wouldn't, recommend it. But it indicates, that, psilocybin is also, metabolized extensively, by the same, by the same, monoamine oxidase, which metabolizes DMT. So there were a couple of questions about the pineal gland. One is, does the pineal gland make serotonin? And that's been known for a long time, since the 60s, and it's confirmed over and over again. So that isn't so surprising. The concentrations of serotonin in the pineal are the greatest of any organ in the body, concentration-wise anyway. Milligram per milligram. In my DMT book, I speculate about the pineal making DMT, and it was intelligent speculation. It wasn't just like I got stoned and thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool if the pineal gland made DMT? There were lots of circumstantial data. And a group, the same group in Ann Arbor, published a paper 7 years ago, demonstrating there was DMT in the living rodent pineal gland. But it actually, turns out that that DMT, which they measured in the probe, which went through the brain into the pineal, out through the brain, and then they measured it. The DMT which they were measuring was probably from the brain, the intervening brain tissue. They weren't expecting the they weren't expecting the brain to make DMT. So they didn't control for the possibility of brain DMT appearing as pineal DMT. But this last this last article that came out in 2019, demonstrating high brain levels of DMT, points to the pineal probably doesn't make DMT, which is no big deal. I mean, it's no skin off my nose. I mean, it's a lot more important to establish what is naturally occurring DMT doing in the body, and it's way more interesting that it's made in the brain at those kinds of concentrations than it's made in the pineal in minuscule concentrations. Well, so the gut, serotonin in the gut. Yeah, there's a lot of serotonin in the gut. I don't think anybody's looked at the relationship between gut serotonin and obviously serotonin receptors in the gut and the psychedelic experience. Just empirically, you drink ayahuasca, it inhibits the breakdown of DMT in the gut. So it's around in the gut, stimulating serotonin and other receptors. So there's got to be, and there's powerful connections, both hormonal and neural between the gut and the brain. So I mean, if anybody out there is a graduate student in physiology or neuroscience, that would be a great thesis. What is the relationship between psychedelics effect on the gut and the behavioral effect? Both in rodents. I mean, obviously you'd have to start there, but in animals, but in humans too. One question, well, I was asked a couple of times, what do I think about how things are going with the psychedelic movement in general? So maybe I could wait on that until later. We talked about this schizo toxin. Are we going to use these medicines to become wiser or more compassionate and better people? Well, I hope so. But then again, don't forget about Charles Manson. Charles Manson gave LSD to his friends, followers, and they were converted from uncertain psychopaths to dedicated serial killers, depending on the model, which was the helter-skelter end of the world model, and Manson's charisma. So if you think taking a psychedelic is going to make you better, compassionate, or more, or more wise, the answer to that question is, if you want to become that way, you should work on that all the time. And then when you trip, you will be primed to attain new insights about becoming better, more compassionate, wiser, come up with some new ideas, be more certain than you ever were before that it's important to be compassionate, better and wiser. So most of the work which is involved in a psychedelic experience occurs outside of the experience. Like if you want to be more spiritual on psychedelics, become a more spiritual person, study texts, pray, meditate, hang out with like-minded people, and then when you trip, that is the raw material that the drug works on. If you're a psychopath, you feel like you've gotten the short end of the stick. You think it's okay to murder if there's a good reason to do so. that's the kind of raw material that the drugs are going to be working on, and they will become fixed, cemented. You're convinced of their truth, their reality. So do your homework first, and and then to the extent that you can set things up during your experience to steer them in a particular direction. And then there's the all important question of integration. But if you're already working on yourself, the integration would become second nature. You would just go back to what you were doing before, but you would be more inspired, more convinced of the truth of what you're doing. Have I tried it myself? What have I done with that information?
I think you've got through the whole list, Dr. Strassman.
Is that true? I think I'm repeating. Oh, there's one question. The question of neuroprotection with DMT. There were some Hungarian studies which demonstrated if you give DMT, or if you drop some in to a petri dish with nerve cells which are being starved of oxygen, the damage resulting from that lack of oxygen is reduced significantly in the presence of DMT. That hasn't been studied in an intact animal, but it has been studied in the test tube. So DMT seems to be neuroprotective in conditions in ischemic conditions, conditions of concentrations of oxygen being low. So that's quite interesting. Because the study which was published last year from Ann Arbor indicated that concentrations of DMT increase up to 10-fold in the dying animal brain. You give an animal a heart attack, stop its heart from beating, and I know there's a lot of strangeness around those kind of animal studies, and we could talk about that. But still, if you have a probe in a rodent's brain, you stop its heart, you measure DMT in that part of the brain, and it increases quite a bit. So there's a couple of things you could infer from those data. One is that DMT is increasing in order to protect the brain from low levels of oxygen. The other is that it could be mediating some of the phenomenological features of the near-death experience. Concentrations increase in the visual cortex in the dying brain, to the greatest extent, and to the extent that a near-death experience is primarily visual. It makes sense. Like, okay, concentrations of naturally occurring DMT are increasing in parts of the brain which mediate the phenomenological aspects of the NDE. There's a couple of studies which could be done, and I'm surprised haven't been done yet. One of them was kind of done by the group at Imperial College, Chris Timmerman. He gave questionnaires of an so he gave NDE questionnaires to DMT smokers, and tallied up their scores. And he gave an NDE questionnaire to individuals that had an NDE from a car crash or heart attack, and he compared the scores, and they were quite similar. So that is circumstantial evidence that there's a relationship between DMT and the NDE. A much more a better study, one that would be more airtight, would be to give those people that have a naturally occurring NDE DMT and say, is this similar to or different than your naturally occurring near-death experience? And so far as I can tell, that study's not been done. I get quite a bit of email, and I've gotten a couple of messages indicating, or from people that have smoked DMT, a month or a year, or however amount of time after a naturally occurring NDE. And some people say it's quite similar. It's the spitting image. It's the exact same thing. And other people have said, they don't resemble each other at all. So I think it needs to be studied in a controlled setting. The other thing would be to measure DMT levels in a dying person, and correlate those levels with their reports of what's going on in their minds. It's still quite difficult, to measure levels of DMT. So I think what we're going to end up doing is, looking at the activity of the gene responsible for the production of the DMT synthesizing enzyme. That would be a lot more accurate, sensitive means of determining the activity of the DMT synthetic machinery.
Thank you for all of that. Wow. Wow. Are you still checking your notes to see if there's any more buried in there?
Yeah, there's one thing buried. How long have I been going? About an hour.
Yeah, we still have time,
I'm
but there's
getting
so
a bit
many new
hoarse.
questions.
Let me. Yeah. So let me, freshen up, and I'll be back in a few minutes.
All right, I appreciate that, Dr. Strassman. Anyone not with a question, just want to come and check in with PPS for a moment while 30+ speakers. Every day we went to midnight, and it was just, wow, fabulous. So Oyi wanted to ask a question to Dr. Strassman back on the question pertaining to selecting your research participants. We'll just wait to confirm that Dr. Strassman has his headphones on and he can hear us before we ask any questions. But you just want to check in, Oyi, and say hello?
Well, I wanted to check in and I wanted to ask a question. So I can, oh, he's miking up.
Okay. Do I go? Does he go? I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris. You can go ahead.
Okay.
Dr. Strassman, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to start a fresh batch of
clear.
Q&A.
Okay.
Starting with Chris.
Hi, Dr. Strassman. Yeah, so I just wanted to ask real quickly about, it's a big thing these days for a lot of people who are, on antidepressants or trying to come off of them or anything like that, to go down to Peru and have ceremonies to go do ayahuasca, or sometimes to do DMT. And my main question was, so what do you think are the primary barriers right now for people accessing, for those who are on SSRIs or have been on them for a number of years or whatever it may be, to accessing DMT safely? And then follow up to that is, what are the risk factors for developing serotonin syndrome between ayahuasca and DMT-NN? Is there a difference, or what are your thoughts there?
Thank you, Chris, for your question. For the future questions, I'm just going to reiterate what Dr. Fadiman said to us at our conference, and that is, if we could keep these questions to one sentence ending in a question mark, it'll make time for everybody's questions. The multi-layered questions, just, I don't know if they're all going to get factored in, so I appreciate the questions, though.
Okay. Well, strictly speaking, you don't want to combine, DMT, if in a situation where you're on, serotonin uptake inhibitor as an antidepressant, both, for the theoretical risk of a serotonin syndrome, as well as, you're depressed. I mean, you're on, the medication for good reason. So, if you're interested in, but that being said, I keep on hearing, like over and over and over again, by, both participants and, leaders of ayahuasca, sessions, that, people take ayahuasca when they're on an antidepressant and they have no problems. So, I'm not sure, what to say. Like as a physician, I couldn't recommend it. I would, because I mean, I couldn't. But anecdotally out there anyway, it seems to be, it seems to occur in the field, safely, at least some of the time. Yeah, and comparing the risk of serotonin syndrome with ayahuasca as opposed to with DMT, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. DMT, concentrations are higher when you smoke it, and they're longer when you drink ayahuasca. You metabolize so quickly that I would think that the smoking would have a lower risk, just because it wouldn't be around that long. To combine with the metabolic pathways that contribute to the serotonin syndrome. So, but yeah, still, serotonin syndrome does not seem to be all that common, at least from my respondents.
Thank you. Okay, Oi, you want to hop on and ask your question? Oh, we got him muted. Hold on. All right, you there?
Yes. Yeah, first off, I just definitely wanted to acknowledge Jayson for the wonderful job he did at the Detroit Psychedelic Conference. Without his know-how and his willingness to organize and his just spirit of family and cooperativeness, we definitely would not have had the success that we had. So I just want to give a big shout out to Jayson from the entire Detroit community. Dr. Strassman, how you doing today?
Good.
So my two very short questions. One was when you said people were coming in, when you were talking about disqualifying people for the study, and some people came in for a microdose, and then if this happened or that happened, then you disqualified them, and then they would come back for a macrodose, and then you were looking for certain things. In the entheogenic community, we use those words very loosely, micro and macro. So what is your definition, or is there some standard definition of macro? Because you have Kalinda Iyi would say anything less than a gram of psilocybin mushrooms was a microdose, and then above maybe in the double digits is a macro dose. So I just wanted to be, my short question is, what is the definitive answer for what do we consider in this community as a macro dose?
Well, I think it depends on what the experience is like. If it's a macro, medium, or a micro dose, that makes it easier to determine, person by person, what's a micro dose for one person and what's a macro dose for somebody else. But you can make some categories, and those would be based on subjective experience. If you take a small dose of something, let's say you want to microdose, I would call that a subjective effect, which you don't notice. It's as if you're it's as if you're taking placebo. You barely feel it, if at all. And in those kinds of cases, if you take psychoactive dose of a psychedelic every day for weeks or months, it acts the same way in your brain as antidepressants do. So if you do notice a subjective effect over time, it would be comparable to what you might experience on Prozac, let's say. And there were studies, back in the 50s that gave very low doses of LSD, to depressed inpatients, and 25 micrograms, 10 micrograms, And they, gradually improved, their mood over the space of a couple of weeks, like you would see in a typical, course prescribing antidepressants. You can take a slightly higher dose, and that slightly higher dose would be stimulating. If you take a small amount of LSD, small amount of psilocybin, before the visions start, that kind of dose, you're stimulated. You're happy. You're thinking more clearly. You're more optimistic. Yes, so that would be low, medium dose. I wouldn't call that a microdose if you're using as your standard the effects that you're looking for. I would call that a low, medium dose. Like a lot of coffee or like cocaine and hash, kind of state of mind. You could take a larger medium dose, at which point things would start getting sparkly. You would start thinking to yourself, "Oh, I'm tripping." Yeah, but it's quite mild. I mean, you can do things. I wouldn't operate heavy machinery, but you could hike, you could read, you could interact, you could cook. But things are sparkly. They're a little strange. I would call that a high medium dose. The macro dose is the full on dose. Well, like you lay down, music, stay close to home. So I don't think you can pinpoint milligrams or micrograms, but you can pinpoint the subjective experience that you're looking for.
I thank you for that answer. My second short answer is you said that the research you were doing, there were a lot of pagans and Wiccans, and I think maybe people of the Jewish faith or community. Were there any people of color, or was there a set of people that represented urban communities? Because there's a lot of mental health issues in people of color and urban communities, and if not, do you know of any?
Well, so our studies began in 1990, and I turned in all of my paperwork in 88 and 89. So the main criteria for diversity was gender. Are we including enough women in the study? And our study was in normal volunteers. We weren't doing any treatment of mental illness or substance abuse. So in our group of normal volunteers, the NIH was interested in including as many women as we could. And even back then, that was a recent development. It was a new thing that had just come down the pipe the last few years. So there wasn't any focus on including other ethnic diversity. It was just gender. There was a volunteer in our study who was an urban shaman, an indigenous Hispanic type, and he worked in the inner city, but we really didn't need to include him in our description of the demographics. Like Hispanic, we didn't need to include Native American. We didn't need to either. It's been a long time since I've applied for any grants. So I would guess if you're looking to get funds from the NIH, you would need, to pay attention, to all manners of diversity. It would be of value, to determine if responses across ethnic, varieties, differ, psychological, biological. So yeah, that would be an interesting study. Somebody out there who's looking to do some graduate work, start to look at ways to include a more diverse sample in your studies, and why, and then design the appropriate experiments.
Thank you, Dr. Strassman.
Thank you, Dr. Strassman. I appreciate you. Have a great day.
Appreciate you, Oi. Returning to dosage, I have a low dose specialist in our community who wants to talk just a minute about microdosing and mini dosing, but please let's keep it to maybe under a minute or so. Hawkeye, if you could.
Oh, certainly, I can do that. I wanted to thank Dr. Strassman as well. I got your book shortly after my first DMT experience in 2003, and it really changed my life. Appreciate you very much for that. I've been messing around with mini dosing and microdosing in lots of substances, and DMT in particular, I find very effective in a mini dose right before doing presentations like this. It elevates the brain space into a much more mental acuity. I really much appreciate that. And I use a vape pen with DMT in a neutral vegetable glycerin. It's very effective. The person using it can use it. They can control the amount, and it's usually a milligram-ish per puff, depending upon how much is in it. It's very, very effective. Thank you for your time. I had one question in regards to your intravenous study. And with the longer duration inside the DMT space, the intravenous infused patients, were the encounters with DMT entities more frequent? Were they more dense? You briefly touched about information exchange with entities. I just wondered if there were a significant increase in those kind of encounters with the increased amount intravenously.
Oh, do you mean the infusion study? The
Yes.
continuous infusion study?
Yes.
Well, that's not been, that still, well, so that study has not started yet. It remains to be seen what the space is like. We did a study, giving a large dose of DMT, 4 times in the morning with, 30-minute intervals. We were interested in determining if tolerance occurred to frequent repeated dosing. And it turns out that the first dose intensity is just as intense as the fourth and final dose. So there was no tolerance to the psychological effects. The last dose was as visual as full of entities or emotional import as the first one was. Just as intense. But there wasn't an increase in entities. In a way, there was an increase in the flow of information. People were able to work through things from the first to the second to the third and the last dose. Personal things, creative things, emotional things. So that there was an intensification of information transfer, I suppose one could say, but not necessarily more beings or bigger, fatter ones or something, more colorful ones.
All right, I appreciate you stepping on, Hawkeye. We got more questions. Go ahead, Dr. Strassman.
Yeah. Well, so you smoke a small amount out of a vape pen. That's the way you microdose?
Yes, most of the time.
And so how many times do you do that?
I'm finding it's most effective with the solution I have at about 3 to 5 puffs, puts me at a very optimal mental accelerated state. And then as time dwindles, it dwindles just as fast as regular DMT macrodoses. You can take a puff or 2 here or there to sustain the effect. And it's not breakthrough, it's sub-breakthrough, but a much higher mental state.
So I want to clarify
so
for
what
the
do you
public.
mean here and there?
I just want to clarify for the people who are listening, if you guys can hear me. Hawkeye is not talking about the vape pen you're going to get from your guy when he says take 3 to 5 hits off of that. So he's talking about something very specific with his own dosing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a small. Yeah, that's a small amount per puff. Well, so when you say you repeat it, here and there, does that mean 10 minutes or an hour or 2 hours?
No, it's much more short-lived. So in a conversation like this, I would probably have hit it once or twice more. It's more like 3 to 5 would get me into the right mental state. And there I'm self-medicating at that point. And then a sustained dose. I kind of imagine you have like a DMT hookah and you're just sort of conversationally having DMT to keep yourself in the conversational mental space that you want to occupy.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, we got Bruce.
Thanks so much for your talk. You touched on this question I had a second ago a little bit, but I wanted you to elaborate. My question has to do with how people who use DMT or ayahuasca somewhat regularly, like maybe once every 2 weeks, in the case of ayahuasca, might develop a tolerance for it or a greater sensitivity to it. Do you have any thoughts about those who develop a greater sensitivity? And does that perhaps indicate some vulnerability psychologically over time, or is it actually something to be welcomed? So people who use, let's say, ayahuasca pretty regularly and feel like they're becoming more and more sensitive, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, if in our study, it was a short study, and we weren't able to demonstrate tolerance in the space of 2 hours, 4 doses. So there's no tolerance, at least in that model. There were some older studies in humans giving it twice a day, a big dose for maybe 3 days. There was no tolerance. There was a cat study. This will raise the hair on the back of your neck. There was a cat study where they gave a full injection of DMT to cats every 2 hours for 21 days, and there was no tolerance. It was a study occurring in Detroit, actually, at the Henry Ford Hospital, I think. So cats injected every 2 hours for 3 weeks straight around the clock didn't demonstrate any behavioral tolerance. It's probably not that common. I think in the case of ayahuasca, you're dealing with a much more complicated situation. You've got the acute effects of the beta carbolines. You've got the long-term effects. Even antidepressants, taken every 2 weeks, they still do modify your brain receptors. So even drinking ayahuasca containing beta carbolines every 2 weeks could still modify what's going on in your brain. So the ayahuasca story, I spent a few months with the UDV. I was a member for a few months, several years ago, and people drink a lot of ayahuasca in those organizations, those groups, those churches. And I didn't, hear of sensitization or tolerance. I think people are able, to negotiate the state better with practice. That's called psychological tolerance, but it's not it's a learning effect as opposed to an effect of the same dose of DMT not producing the same response. Sensitization, that only occurs in one study that I remember. It was a cat study too, I think. And it was actually performed by Chris Gillen, that old mentor of mine in La Jolla. And it was a study with 5-methoxy-DMT. I don't remember the schedule, the regimen, how often it was given for how many days. But but it was a full dose, and they describe sensitization. The same dose of drug increasingly produce the effect, or is a stronger and stronger effect with the same dose. Mm-hmm. Or if you wanted the same response, you would be able to attain that with a lower dose. And so the whole mechanism of sensitization, it ties in to seizures, epilepsy disorder, kindling, all that kind of stuff. You get a greater neurological response with time, with repeated exposure to a substance. So I wouldn't want to see sensitization to any psychedelic. Tolerance is common with it and any other kind of psychoactive drug, barbs or opiates or those kinds of things. Psychedelics too. You take LSD every day for 3-4 days and you stop having much of an effect.
Thank you.
Next up, is it Brett? Brett, are you with us? Okay, I'm going to go to David and Teresa.
Hi, so I have I have a couple of questions. So number one, on the microdosing of DMT, if you use a dab straw and you microdose 10 milligrams of harmaline, and 3 minutes later microdose 10 to 15 milligrams of DMT, it's a lovely experience, and it kind of extends out to about 30 minutes. It's pretty calming. You can remember an awful lot of things. You can also do that at a higher dose. I would not recommend harmaline with a full dose of DMT because it would extend that experience. Same thing with the amount of harmaline. But when we're talking about microdosing, I know someone asked that question, and that's kind of our experience on that. But my question to you is, do you have any experience when it comes to near-death experience? There was a study done out of the Brain Institute in Paris in 2017, and the results were released last year, saying that they compared all the various psychedelics and a lot of drugs on 150 near-death experiences, and that they said the number one was ketamine for mimicking a near-death experience. The number two was salvia divinorum. And I wanted to know, do you have any experience with studying or utilizing salvia divinorum?
Yeah, that's that ketamine study, or that French study pointing to ketamine came out shortly after the Imperial College paper
Okay.
saying that is DMT. So yeah, I think the jury's out. The best way to study it is to give people that have had an NDE DMT and say how similar is that, or you could give them ketamine, or you can give them ketamine,
Right.
and ask them how similar the two states are.
That's what
salvia is salvia came out a few years after I stopped my study. There have been, I think, 3 groups that have looked at salvia in humans. The Hopkins group, Harvard group, and a Yale group have given salvia to humans. And I don't think people have compared NDE scores with salvia, but that would be a pretty simple study to do. Give the same questionnaire for the NDE that was used to establish a similarity between DMT and ketamine compared to the NDE. And well, yeah, and you could use it for salvia. That surprises me actually, that salvia would be seen to be so similar. I mean, I smoked pure salvia, back in the day when it first came out, and it was very strange. It really, it's clearly psychedelic, but it's a whole different flavor of experience.
Yeah, that study also surprised me too, because that's exactly who they tested all these substances on, is people who had near-death experiences. And of those substances, they used LSD, psilocybin, they used DMT, They used well, I mean, they used a lot of substances, okay? But what they said most closely matched the NDE, number 1 was ketamine, and number 2 was salvia. And DMT was like 5th on the list, and LSD was like 15th, and mushrooms was like 22nd. So they went through this, like this whole thing on it. So they did compare it to people who had NDEs. And it was their subjective review in the study. In other words, this was the most close when they had those. So I've never done salvia, so I don't know. Next on the list, but just, wondered about that.
Well, yeah, it's what's called conflicting results. So you'll need a third study to help, settle it out, or, many, many more. But the definitive study is, the one, that I mentioned. Give the drug to somebody that's had an NDE and ask them to compare.
All right. Up next.
Thank you.
On.
Hi, Dr. Rick Strassman. Earlier, you discussed the Hungarian studies showing that DMT shows a neuroprotection with ischemic conditions. So what are your thoughts on DMT and people who are experience COVID-19 right now?
Would I recommend smoking DMT or microdosing DMT if you've got COVID, if you want to prevent COVID, if you want to heal up from COVID? Well, I mean, you want to do everything you can to stay healthy, minimize being sick and then recuperate. DMT, psilocybin as well, they've both been shown to be capable of increasing neuroplasticity. Growing neuron endings, longer, more ramified, increased connections between neurons. So, if you believe protection is a good thing, no, I'm sorry. If you believe neuroplasticity is a good thing, and they're beginning to understand, the mechanism of antidepressants as increasing neuroplasticity. That may be one of the ways that ketamine is an effective antidepressant so quickly, is that the neuroplastic effects begin quite soon, like within minutes, within hours. So to the extent that COVID causes ischemia or neurotoxic effects, I mean, obviously it's a very complicated situation, but it would be something to study is probably what I would say.
Thank you.
Excellent. Kelly.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Strassman. So I had a list of questions, but I'm just going to pick one. I narrowed it down to one that I'm really interested in finding out from you about. But thank you for everything you did for the research to make that possible and for the book. Thoroughly enjoyed it. So my question, have you stayed in contact with the Zen Buddhism order that you belong to in the past? And have their views on psychedelics changed at all, publicly or privately? Or are they still against the use of psychedelics?
One question mark.
Well, it's been quite some time since I've corresponded with that Zen order. 20 years, probably 23, 24 years. Yeah. Some of the old timers are still there. But I haven't corresponded with anyone there in, over 2 decades. They're a very private group, which is, why I don't mention their name very, very much or at all. Yeah, so they really, they don't go around giving talks, they don't write books, they don't go out giving lectures, so I would be surprised if their views changed, especially public views. Their private views were quite, positive in my corresponding with them over the years and my visits there and spiritual counseling and whatnot. individually, privately, they were quite keen on psychedelics as being the reason they got interested in Buddhism. But they just felt constrained to speak about that publicly because it's a complicated relationship. The effects are subtle, and it could be misinterpreted. They didn't want to associate drugs and Buddhism on their watch. So as Jim said, Jim Fadiman is an old friend. I was complaining one day to Jim, "Oh, the monastery, they're so mean." And he said, "Well, what do you expect them to say? Right. Yeah, take psychedelics, become a monk." Yeah, so I don't blame them.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, I wish we had time for all your questions because they're very powerful. Maybe if we do another round, we'll get those inserted in there. But I want to go to Max, and then I want to give a few minutes so that we can all say thank you for Rick coming and doing this for us because, I think this is direct information from the source. You're hearing it right from the man's face and for free, and we're just making that connection. So I just want everybody to have a chance to say thank you, but let's go at the last question with Max.
Hi, Dr. Strassman. I actually have a question that is somewhat tangentially related to the last question. So there are anecdotes of Western travelers giving LSD to yogis, to Buddhist monks, who allegedly feel nothing, do not feel effects from these substances. And if such anecdotes are to be believed, do you think it's feasible that these holy men are somehow able to activate, the endogenous production of DMT through accessing intense states of meditative focus? And if so, do you think that this would, produce a tryptamine cross tolerance that could account for the lack of effects from the LSD?
Right. Yeah. That was one of my questions, kind of spurring me on that story. And Be Here Now. Ram Dass gives this fat Indian guy who sits wrapped up in a blanket like this massive dose of LSD, like 1,000 micrograms, and the guy just twinkles at him. So there are two ways of explaining that. One is that he's tolerant to LSD because he's producing a lot of psychedelic tryptamines in the first place, which would make sense if it weren't what that we were talking about DMT. If he were producing LSD in his brain constantly, and that was responsible for his elevated state, then if you gave LSD, there would be tolerance, or he would be clearly not as responsive to it. But there is no tolerance to DMT, so or cross tolerance between LSD and DMT. So there is something unique about DMT. It doesn't produce tolerance to its own effects, and there's no cross tolerance with LSD. So that was one of my theories, which was and there's another explanation for a realized yogi to be non-responsive, or at least to appear non-responsive to DMT, or to appear non-responsive to a large dose of LSD, and that would be behavioral tolerance, which I mentioned earlier. You learn to manage the state. So his response subjectively to 1,000 micrograms of LSD would be like anybody else's, but because of his ability to negotiate in highly altered states from meditation or his own biology, he would be able to to manage, he'd be able to function, tripping as hard as a normal person might trip on LSD at that dose. But still, it's an appealing theory, and I put it to the test with one of our volunteers was a former Buddhist monk who had a certified Kensho experience, and his response to DMT was, pretty mild. Like he could still move, he could still talk. And I thought, oh, that's, proof that, people that are, naturally high, might be, less responsive to administering DMT. But the next, person who, had a smaller response to DMT was just this normal guy. He had never meditated a day in his life. He was a bartender. He swam every day. I think he was taking a couple of classes at UNM. And, we gave him a full dose of DMT. It was the screening dose. And he looks, down at his vein and he said, did you give it? Like he felt nothing at all. In, the case of the monk, it was like, oh, I can still move, I can still talk. But in, this guy, Joe, yeah, there was just no response. I, looked at his vein, did I miss the vein? Is there like a lump of DMT under his skin? But, no, it, like it all went in. And he's, saying, are you done? Yeah, so, he had, zero response and he was not enlightened. He could have been enlightened. We used to tease him like, you're enlightened, but you don't know it. But I think that's unlikely. I think he's just one of these, people who, I think he just metabolizes DMT very quickly. Terrence and I talked about that once, and he said about 5% of the people he's given DMT to didn't respond. And in our close to 60 volunteers, there were 2 people that didn't respond that much, which would be around 5%. So I think those people need to be studied. Are they metabolizing it more quickly? Are their receptors different somehow? And can you give them a dose at which they break through? I think there are some interesting questions that could be asked.
Oh, definitely agree. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming back, being patient, taking notes, giving thoughtful responses. I know that I am only partially being able to thank you. That's why I have unmuted a bunch of microphones. If somebody wants to help me thank Dr. Strassman now, your microphone is unmuted, please.
Thank you for changing the narrative on psychedelic use to a more clinical research role. That needed to happen. The modality changed everything, including my life. Thank you so very much.
Well, thanks. It's good to hear that.
Peggy, Tobias.
Thanks so much, Dr. Strassman, for coming to speak and answering all of our questions. It was incredibly insightful, and I'm just so appreciative of you taking the time to do this for us. Thank you.
Yes, and I want to say thank you as well, Dr. Strassman. I just think it was such a thrill when Jayson said that you had responded to our book group and saying, I might be free that afternoon. It just made us laugh, and we were so excited to have you here. And I loved reading your book, and I learned a lot, and I really appreciate your time and spending it with us. Thank you.
Nancy and Peter?
Well, thanks.
I just want to say thank you so much. It's just so much information, and I'm new to the journey, so I'm trying to absorb as much information as I possibly can, and this has just been incredible. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And likewise, I'm engaged in my own psychonautic journey, and from what I can see, we're all just getting started. This work is going to change the world in many ways.
Donna and Joe?
It is going to change the world, but we need to be prepared for it's changing the world in at least some degree, not in a good way. I mean, we ought not be surprised if another Charles Manson doesn't arise at some point. So we need to be prepared to respond to those kinds of events in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Strassman. It's an honor to have you here. Thanks for your valuable time here today. We appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Casey?
Yeah, thank you so much for supporting our organization in this way. You know, this this is what we do, is offer these kind of educational events for people to raise awareness. And so this is a huge, huge contribution. Thank you so much.
Sarah.
Yeah, it's important to educate. If you want to optimize effects, educate.
That's our mission.
Sari.
Hi, I just wanted to, tell you that I think this has just been like such a wonderful gift, and allowing our community to come together and really like share this opportunity to like learn and grow together and ask these important questions, so that we can take something away with us and expand on it on our own and within our own community. It's really, really appreciated. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you again. So with that, I just want to take one moment to announce we have a DMT discussion group going on September 4th. That's a Friday. Hawkeye, are you still in the room? Would you maybe want to come do your talk at that group?
Let's get together privately over scheduling. I think tentative, yes.
Okay, cool. Otherwise, it'll just be an open discussion for the people who come. It'll just be, we'll talk about DMT, our experiences, we'll exchange information. The last one we did in June was really had some real interesting stuff brought up at that one. You can check out our blog when that's around for more on that. And also, like Casey was saying, Casey's the president of our organization. It's just an assembly of volunteers trying to put this together and make and facilitate meetings for people who are showing up to the meetings and the greater public. And so what we would like to do is, if you thought this meeting was valuable, if you learned something from it or something, if you thought this was worth $1 for sitting through and attending, you got that one question you never thought you would get to ask, you got to meet somebody who's kind of a celebrity in the psychedelic world, please go to our website, www.portlandpsychedelicsociety.org, and make a donation. It could be $1. It goes a long way. Our costs are not super high, but we do have some. And so helping us out a little bit, it's not being paid volunteers, it's volunteers, and everything is spent going outwards. So I appreciate everybody and every dollar that anybody else. Closing thoughts? All right, Dr. Strassman, closing thoughts?
Well, we covered a lot of territory. Oh, if people have follow-up questions or they want to get back to me, feel free to write. You can find my email address on my website. It's rjstrassman@gmail.com. So I pretty much answer every email I get, at least the first one.
RJ Strassman
at I'm at Gmail.
Great.
Gmail.
Great. Yeah, we'd probably love to have you back maybe in October or something. October, November, if you want to do another round.
Yeah, let's be in touch about that. Yeah.
Okay. Righteous. Could be something different. I appreciate your time so much. All right.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jayson. Yeah. And my apologies again to blowing up last time. I mean, I'd never had a lightning strike discontinue a event before, so I'm glad the connection
that builds
was good
anticipation.
Tonight.
So.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. See you later.
Goodbye, everyone. Good night. Have a good one.
Bye, everybody.
Discussion September 4. What'd you guys think? Can we put it so people can unmute themselves now?
I can do that.
Appreciate that.
That was really good.